Hello, my friends. We are up to the sixth video in a series of videos on essentials for astrological research. And this essential guideline for astrological research is specific to astrology. This problem does not come up in most other forms of research, and it's the problem of the implicate order and undivided wholeness. Now, the implicate order and undivided wholeness is a theory. So some people may say it's not a problem because it doesn't exist. It's just a concept introduced by some scientists. But I think that something very similar to the implicate order and undivided wholeness makes sense to almost any astrologer, and we can all see this. The terms implicate order and undivided wholeness were introduced by David Bohm. David Bohm was a physicist. He was a close friend and a colleague of Albert Einstein. He wrote a book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And in this book, he explains that the most reasonable explanations for many of the findings in modern physics, when we try, in other words, to try to understand what is going on at, for example, the subatomic level, at this level that our eyes cannot see, what is going on to produce the motions of particles and other behavior that we see. What is going on is that there must be an undivided wholeness. There must be a way in which everything is interconnected, that nothing is ever really separate, and that wholeness, this integrated undivided wholeness, is more fundamental. It's more primary than the apparent separateness. And so there's this oneness. So this kind of mystical vision of the nature of reality was the best way to explain the results from physics according to David Bohm. So there's an implicate, a kind of embedded order and a wholeness which is not obvious because we're just seeing these what seem like separate expressions. In one interview of David Bohm that you can find on YouTube, the interviewer says, "But you and I are separate. So how do you get this wholeness? You know, we're separate beings." And he says, "Our separateness is an abstraction. We're actually not separate. We're more connected, and everything is more interconnected than it appears to be." If we make this assumption, it's easier to understand many of the findings and observations in physics. So this undivided wholeness, it's wonderful. We're all connected. It's very liberating. It's spiritually enlightening way of viewing the world and understanding what's going on. But it actually makes astrology more difficult. It makes it more difficult, especially because the more we open up to this undivided wholeness, the more receptivity we have to it, the more that we recognize it, the more that we connect to our oneness and the thoughts and feelings that are connecting all of us, and the more good intentions we have and goodwill and selflessness, and the more we feel that we are a part of everything and we need to take care of everything and everyone, the more we become conscious of this and clearly attuned to the undivided wholeness, and that things fit into place in ways that we can call synchronicity, we can call it serendipity, we can call it divination, we can call it psychic. And we astrologers use all those terms. They're all true. There is synchronicity, there is serendipity, there is divination, there is psychic ability. These are all different aspects of the undivided wholeness. The reason why we can be psychic is because we're all connected. So of course we're psychic if you can open up to those channels. And the first way to open up to those channels to be psychic, or to be able to practice divination, or for your life to be a series of experiences that are serendipity and to recognize the synchronicity is to recognize that it exists. As long as we believe we're separate and fighting each other for survival in this whole battle of separate individuals, if that's all we think life is, that's all we're going to see. This goes back to how we process information and how we see things according to the way they will fit into our understanding. The more that we see we're all connected in this undivided wholeness, the more we operate, the more easily we can operate from the viewpoint of undivided wholeness. And this direct connection with everything is often the basis of the accuracy of our astrological perceptions. Let's put it all together with some of the other things we said. We have our brains, which are pattern recognition machines. I mean, they just boom. We have all of the complexity of astrology, all of the subtle nuances, all of the different things going on. It's raw material to build whatever pattern recognition and relationship we want to see. And while we are attuned to our oneness and interconnectedness, and we have this goodwill to feel a part of that person's life, we are able to intuitively assemble from the raw material of the astrological principles a story that's really built from, you can call it divination, you can call it psychic, you can call it spiritual, whatever you want to call it. Our connection to this undivided wholeness is revealing to us. It's speaking to us. It's telling us what's going on, and then we verbalize it, we interpret it, and we express it using the language of astrology, pulling together whatever astrological variables we happen to notice in an integrated story. And if you watch carefully, you will notice that each astrologer pulls out different things, a different emphasis. Leo in one case is proud, in another case it's arrogant, in another case it's loyal. In all of these different attributes, the astrological symbols become this kind of magical imagery that can metamorphosize into different things. And they metamorphosize according to our connection with undivided wholeness and what it needs to draw out of the symbols to make the interpretation work. So that there's a lot of illusion going on, that we're reading the astrology chart when what's happening is we are connected to undivided wholeness and being informed by that wholeness, and then using the astrology as a flexible language in which to act as a container and a vehicle for us to explain the ideas. This happens. This is part of the astrological experience. It doesn't mean that all of astrology is this. It doesn't mean that, excuse me, that there are no rules of astrology. But it does mean that this goes on, and this is an obstacle to knowing what is the astrology and what is our connection to undivided wholeness that use the symbolism and storylines of astrology to weave a fabric of a person's life that is very accurate because of our connection to undivided wholeness and has nothing to do with the actual accuracy of the astrological symbolism. I am a firm believer that astrology actually works, that the astrological symbolism is more than symbolism. The astrology actually works. It has a measurable effect on our lives. But finding that is not going to be easy because we have all of these obstacles in the way. But it is there. It is there. So the fact that there is this undivided wholeness that we tune into and is often the source of the accuracy of our interpretations, and it's not the astrology, that does not mean that there's also not some valid astrology as well, which is what some people who assume as soon as they realize the extent to which the astrologer is getting information from some other source. It's not so much directly from the astrological details. So, you can use divination. You can practice divination or psychic or whatever you want to call it and be helpful to people. Just be aware that this very often clouds our understanding of what the astrology actually tells us. Because very often what the astrology does is it provides some convenient symbols which we can mold to fit what our connection to undivided wholeness is telling us. And it's the undivided wholeness that has the answers for us and not the astrology. These are challenges. I don't think that's all there is to astrology. And not only that, we've overcome all those challenges. We've done one research study after another, finding out how astrology actually works. So you can get past all these things. Now here's another thing that works against us, and this sounds like an oxymoron, that things that are extremely infrequent happen frequently. Well, that just sounds like I just totally contradicted myself. Are they infrequent or are they frequent? Well, what's happening is that there are so many things that we look at. Let me read these last few sentences in this paragraph. Starting here, whoops. Sorry about that. Let me get back to where I was. If the probability is 1 in a million, then only once in a million times would an error be made. So why does it happen so often? Why does it happen even in physics, even in the hardest of sciences? Scientists make discoveries and then retract them. They say, oh, we discovered something. And then a half a year later say, oh, well, we didn't really discover it. Did you know that's happening? It's happening a lot. And there's a video called Particle Physics Discoveries That Disappeared by physicist Sabine Hassenfelder. I've got a link to it in the description for this presentation. And she gives many very interesting examples. It's a very interesting and entertaining presentation on how physicists periodically discover something and then later say, oh no, I didn't discover it. How can that be? Because a lot of physics, most sciences, is not an unambiguous observation. It's an observation that's made, and the probability of making that observation is calculated. And if that observation is 1 in a billion, well, then it's considered to be a valid observation. You know, I mean, if it's 1 in a billion, it's not happening by chance. But what happens is very often things do happen that are 1 in several million or 1 in a billion. And how can that be? It's because every day there are thousands of scientists making thousands of observations. So if you have 1,000 scientists making 1,000 observations a month, that's 1,000 times 1,000 is 1,000,000 observations, means that a 1 in a million probability is going to happen once a month by chance. So the more people who are working at something and the more observations they're making, the more often extremely unusual things will be observed. And they are not really there. You thought you saw something, but it was actually a speck on the photographic plate or some other reason for it, and it was a 1 in a million chance that a speck could land on the photograph at that instant when you're taking the picture, or some, making a ridiculously simple example, but to reflect the idea that an extraordinary number of coincidences do all come together. The more people making more observations leads to more false discoveries. So astrology, not astrology, I mean science moves forward in a meandering way. So science is an enterprise of extreme persistence, teamwork, and gradually meandering forward, sprinkled with periodic brilliant insights. Given the complexity of the variables in astrology, we can expect the same in astrology. With the extraordinarily limited resources invested into sophisticated astrological research, the progress that has been made is impressive, even though cynics of astrology give the impression that astrology has hopelessly failed in its enormous number of attempts to confirm the theories. There have not been an enormous number of attempts to confirm theories in astrology. There's mainly been cynics of astrology or astrologers doing very simplistic kinds of research on sun signs or something like that. Sophisticated research in astrology is extremely rare, and research requires a lot of persistence and teamwork. So we can expect things to take a long time. And also we can expect to make some blunders. Blunders always happen. If blunders are not happening, people are not doing the research. So that's what it's all about. Here's another interesting point that Sabine Hassenfelder makes that I think is very important for astrology. She points out what a pseudoscience is. What is a pseudoscience? A pseudoscience is, sometimes people say it's something that's not logical, blah, blah, blah. Here's how she defines pseudoscience, and I love her definition. It's the best one I've ever seen. She says it's holding on to a belief when the evidence contradicts the belief. So when you do the empirical research, when you look at the databases, when you do the extreme case sampling studies and other kinds of studies, and you see what's happening, if we hold on to a belief that contradicts our observations, that's a pseudoscience. So the key to a pseudoscience is to adjust our thinking to the observations. So whether astrology is a pseudoscience or not depends on whether we are willing to adopt modern research methods. If you're unwilling to verify your observations and you just want to believe them based on your own personal experience and your continued ability to fit your observations into your assumptions, which is very easy for the human mind to do, as we discussed, that's a pseudoscience. But if you're willing to test your ideas and adopt modern research methods, carefully test our astrological ideas and respond appropriately to the results of the research, then astrology is not a pseudoscience. So I can say that the astrology that we practice with vibrational astrology, it's not a pseudoscience. We're building models based on the data. The models fit the data. We proceed very cautiously and carefully, and we do the same things that any other rigorous scientific enterprise would do to develop the ideas. So, but that's an exception to the rule. In general, very little astrology has done any kind of extensive research like we do in vibrational astrology, and then when it does, it doesn't respond to the findings. Such as when Galcoin found that the cadent houses, like 9th and 12th house, have a stronger effect than the cardinal houses, but astrologers ignore that and continue to say the cardinal houses are stronger without even considering Galcoin's results. Just going ahead with the traditional idea, that's a pseudoscience. Pseudoscience means you're not responding to the data. Okay, 10th of our 11 essential guidelines is the importance of extreme cases. I've referred to this several times, but we need to give this importance to extreme cases, its own emphasis as a separate essential guideline. So let's suppose that you develop a model for ADHD in which hard aspects between Moon and Uranus most strongly inclined to ADHD. Soft aspects less so, and you go on to apply approximate weights, and you come up with the following astrosignature. So again, astrosignature just means a collection or a list of astrological variables. And you weight them. You get to give a number of points to each one. Give more points to the ones that are more important. So suppose you come up with this for ADHD. I just made this up. I didn't do any research. This is just made up for teaching purposes. Moon square opposition semi-square sextile quadrate Uranus gets 10 points. Moon conjunct trine or sextile Uranus 5 points. Mercury square opposition semi-square sextile quadrate Uranus 7 points. Mercury conjunct trine or sextile Uranus 3 points. Mars square opposition semi-square sextile quadrate Uranus 5 points. Mars conjunct trine sextile Uranus 2 points. And let's give a 5-degree orb to all of these aspects. So this is an astrosignature. Is it a good one? Does it look good to you? What do you think of it? Good just in terms of, is that a good set of variables to consider? You know, assuming that they did show up more than average in the data. Is that a good way to assemble your information? Excuse me. Into an astrosignature? Yes, it is. This is a beautiful astrosignature. It's simple and elegant. It's consistent with astrological theory that Moon and Uranus, could be disruptive. Mercury and Uranus could be disruptive. Mars and Uranus disruptive. There's nothing wrong with the Moon Uranus having a bigger impact than Mercury Uranus, and Mercury Uranus stronger than Mars Uranus. We would expect aspects to have slightly different emphasis. Maybe you can come up with a reason for why the Moon Uranus would be the strongest and Mars Uranus the weakest, and giving more points to hard aspects and soft aspects certainly is a reasonable thing to do. This is all very reasonable. The concept behind it is simple, and it's good. So this is an astrosignature. Now, here's an important point. In statistical language, in the language of statistics and research methods, an astrosignature is a regression model. More specifically, it's a linear regression model. And we can use what research methodologists have found out about linear regression models and apply that to the astrosignature, because the astrosignature is a regression model. A regression model means a list of predictor variables, and each predictor variable is given its own weight. That's what a regression model is in its simplest form. It can be made more complicated, but that's a regression model in its simplest form, and in its simplest form, it's also called a linear regression model. So there are many ideas in astrology that can reasonably put into an astrosignature, which is a regression model. Now, your formal model, your specific model, like this one, with Moon, hard aspect to Uranus, 10 points, etc., it does not need to reflect your thinking perfectly. It's not a perfect representation of how you think about the astrology behind ADHD. It only needs to be a reasonable representation. That's all. So the formal model does not need to perfectly reflect every detail of how the researcher envisions the way in which predictor variables are associated with the outcome variables. It only needs to capture how we think of our model reasonably well. Reasonably well. Capture some of the feeling of how we expect the predictor variables to be related to the outcome variables. The regression model can also be made more complex by having what are called interactions between predictor variables and other adjustments. But at this stage of astrological research, where we're venturing into making astrology data-driven, a simple linear regression model is very adequate. You're just making a list of astrological variables that you think are related to the outcome variable, such as ADHD, and you weight each one, give more weight to the ones you think are more important. Very simple. That's all you need to do. Now, this bottom paragraph and we get into something very interesting. You can have a regression model. Typically, any regression model has the predictor variables, the astrological variables, and they're usually continuous because as the moon square Uranus aspect gets more exact, we give it more points because it's stronger. So we get a score. Let's go back up to this astro signature. We can, if you have moon square Uranus in your natal chart with no orb, you get 10 points. If the orb is halfway to maximum, 2.5 degrees, so it's halfway to 5 degrees, we can give it half the points. So we can give more points as the aspect is more exact, and we can total up your astro signature score. And that astro signature score becomes the astrological prediction of your inclination to have ADHD. So typically, the predictor variable, which is the astro signature score, is what we call a continuous variable. It has fractions, it could be 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. It's just a continuous number, like just measuring your height or your weight or anything. It's a continuous number. Now, ADHD could be just on or off. You have ADHD or you don't have it. You could also have levels of ADHD. More severe cases could be given 10 points. Very weak case, 1 point, or you fall somewhere in between. So the outcome variable could be on or off. It could be you have ADHD or you don't. And then we still have a regression model. There's a fancy term for it. That's called a logistic regression model. And we use logistic regression. It's just a fancy word for having an outcome variable that's on or off. You have it or you don't have it. But a very interesting thing happens when the outcome variable, the astrological variable, is also continuous. So if you have, like I said, levels of ADHD, where extreme ADHD is given 10, and a little weaker 9, weaker 8, and so on, then you get something very interesting. You get this conclusion that if someone with extreme ADHD, if there are levels of ADHD, and you have somebody with the most extreme level, and you have that information, you've scored the people by how intense their ADHD is. And if you have somebody who has extreme ADHD, but the astrological formula does not predict it. Moon is not square Uranus. Mars is not square Uranus. None of those things are happening. You have a huge problem. Excuse me. You have a huge problem when you have an extreme outcome and no evidence in the astrology for it. Or vice versa. The astrology is very strong. The person has Moon square Uranus, Mercury square Uranus, Mars square, blah, blah, blah. Everything almost exact. They're the highest scoring person, and they have no symptoms at all of ADHD. Those extreme cases, it can be an extreme predictor variable. So, for example, when we did the astrology, the zodiac signs, and we found that Clint Black has more Aquarius than anybody else. Extreme case. If he has no expressions of what we think Aquarius should be, or very few, this is a disaster. This is bad news. This means you have not found anything. You do not have to do a lot of fancy statistics and have all these control groups. If you're predicting somebody's going to be extreme and they have none of that, or they are extreme and you don't see it, it destroys your ability to make a claim that there is a relationship. So let's make sure this is clear. Let me give this very simple and concrete example. Suppose you have an astro signature that tells you whether a person will be skinny or heavy. Are they going to be thin or heavy? And you have a measurement for how heavy the person is, body mass index, which is a fairly simple thing based on how tall you are and how much you weigh. So the taller you are, you should weigh more, etc. So there's an average weight for a given height. And so you see how heavy set you are versus how thin you are. And then we could come up with an astrosignature. Venus-Saturn aspects, maybe they make you thinner. Venus-Jupiter aspects tend to make you heavier. Now, excuse me, suppose you have 30 people and you have their BMI score. You have their astrology chart, and your theory is that Venus-Saturn makes you thin, Venus-Jupiter makes you heavy. And you have one person who has an exact Venus-Saturn square, no Venus-Jupiter aspect, and the person is one of the heaviest of the 30 people, has the highest BMI score. And suppose you have one example of just the opposite, where one of the thinnest people, lowest BMI scores, has an exact Venus-Jupiter square and no Venus-Saturn aspect. That one case, this is what's not intuitively obvious probably, that one or two cases that do not fit your model destroy, they bring down your correlation. You can run what's called a correlation coefficient. Pearson product moment correlation coefficient is the long term for it. We usually just call it the letter R, or just call it the correlation value. The correlation value becomes extremely weak when you have exceptions to the rule at the extreme ends. And if you think about it, this makes sense. It makes sense. If you have a person who's got the biggest BMI, no Venus-Jupiter, does have Venus-Saturn, totally contradicts your theory, those extreme exceptions to the rule destroy your ability to form any association, and they should destroy it. Because if you have the heaviest person out of 30 people and they completely are opposite to your model, we do not just say, oh, well, we can have one or two extreme exceptions to the rule. No. When you put it through the mathematics of how the correlation coefficient is calculated, they destroy your ability to have a good finding, and they should destroy it. So your extreme cases should work. You can think of it like this. If you can't predict that the person with the lowest BMI, the thinnest person, if you got them completely wrong, just completely wrong, and you thought they were going to be very heavy, how are you going to predict anybody else? You're not. So, what we can do in this third paragraph here, I explain, you can take this information and use it in a very clever way. You can study the extreme cases. You can study just the people who have the heaviest, have the highest BMI, and the thinnest, the ones who have the lowest BMI. Just study those extreme cases and see what they have in their charts. Because they are controlling the correlation more than anybody else. And if we can get a formula that fits them, we have a good hope of having a formula that fits all the people. So we can just jump right to the extreme cases. Okay. And I have a lot of additional videos. So I've got 1, 2, 3 videos mentioned here on extreme case sampling and why it's so important. One is called Extreme Case Sampling, the Fast Path to Understanding Astrology. It explains a lot of the technical details of why extreme cases work. And another one that explains the details of why it works is a video called Outliers, Correlation Values, and Extreme Case Sampling. And another one is how we first use case study interviews followed by extreme case sampling to understand zodiac signs. Okay, I want to just make sure. I must have it on this next. Oh, yeah. It's on the next slide. This is a very important point. This idea of using extreme case sampling, looking at the extreme cases to find out what's going on, is being used by geneticists. They use this to discover the genetic basis of physical traits and behaviors. So what they do is they do a full genetics analysis. In fact, they've done it for exactly this example. For people with the highest BMI, the heaviest people, maybe the top 10 or 20 or 30 heaviest people in a large database. And they do it for the thinnest people. And they look for genes that are associated with the heavy people only and with the thin people only. Because to do the genetic analysis for everyone is too time consuming and too expensive, so they do it for just the extremes. And they have been able, these geneticists have been able to discover genes for obesity using extreme case sampling. They take the findings from this, they apply it to people in general, and it is able to predict the tendency to be obese. It's very exciting, and what we came up with in astrology is identical to what's been the geneticists have come up with for research as well. So we're following in tune with genetics research, using the same kind of methodology and to get the same kind of results. So there's a video about this as well that I made using a genetics research method in astrology, and you can watch that video. All these videos, I have a link to them in the description for this presentation. Very exciting that there are these tricks. You can just analyze a handful of charts, find out what's going on, and very often it will generalize to the entire population, and you can actually make discoveries this way. These are research methods that have come up in the last 5, 10, 20 years. You don't find them in the older literature. Very exciting that there are all these new ways to get information. Okay, let's see, this is our last thing, so let's go ahead. You know what, I'm at 37 minutes. Let's leave these last 2 points for a final video, because I've got point 11 on effect size and confidence level, and then also some conclusions based on this entire series. So that deserves its own video. It's going to take at least 10 or 15 minutes, maybe more. We're already at 38 minutes. Let's stop this video here. We'll do the 11th and last essential guideline for astrology research, and we'll summarize some conclusions and some ideas based on what we have learned here. Okay, my friends, thank you very much. God bless. Namaste.